evening, friends, and thank you for joining us for our fourth and final Treasures of the Meetinghouse. I'm Reverend Mary Margaret Earle, and I'm the Executive Director of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry. And this is the last of 4 webinars co-sponsored by our partner, the Roxbury Historical Society, highlighting the treasures of our historic urban ministry Meetinghouse, commonly known as First Church in Roxbury. The Roxbury Meetinghouse, Boston's oldest surviving wood frame church building and a pending Boston landmark, is no longer home to a congregation, but we're transforming it into a space to serve as a true meeting house, a place for the Roxbury neighborhood to come for the arts, humanities, and community life. The congregation of First Church in Roxbury gathered on this site in 1631, built the first meeting house in 1632, and worshiped here until 1976, when the congregation, which had dwindled into a very small congregation, folded and merged with the urban ministry. Now, the urban ministry operates our programs out of this campus, the 2 historic buildings, and a connector justice and education center. Our urban ministry mission in Greater Boston is to work across race and place to dismantle racism and white supremacy culture and to advance racial, social, and economic justice. In 2022, our programs include programs and services for survivors of domestic violence, a high school after-school program, and also a lot of arts and humanities offerings, things that we hope one day will fill our meeting house and have it be alive with music and community. 5 years ago, we completed a full exterior restoration of the meeting house. Come visit us and you'll come upon a beautiful building as lovely as it was when it was built in 1804. And last spring, we completed an historic green space restoration too. And now we're planning an interior restoration, one that will affirm the historic integrity of the building while making it into an event space for today and tomorrow. We've worked with Roxbury neighbors, artists, and historic preservationists to imagine together what this space will look like in the coming years. But the work that we're undertaking is not only about plaster and paint, it's also about examining our history. In collaboration with the Roxbury Historical Society, we're beginning an examination into the history of First Church's relationship with enslaved people and enslavers, and with those who profited from the slave trade. We'll ask where First Church congregants and ministers stood on issues of enslavement and abolition. It's important to look more squarely at the past that we've inherited. Highlighting the importance of examining this full history is a word from our former urban ministry board member, a current board member of the Roxbury Historical Society, and a deeply knowledgeable historian, former state representative Byron Rushing. Here's a message from him now.
History means people and events through time. We do not know where we are if we cannot remember where we're from. We cannot take and make informed decisions about where to go if we can't recognize where we are and where we have been. History is time, past, present, and future. There are buildings which tell us parts of these stories. The stories of all the peoples who founded the nation and worked to continue to transform it today. In Roxbury, we are fortunate to have one of those buildings preserved in First Church Roxbury. First Church Roxbury. Come read it. Listen to its story. Remember how you have known it in your own story. Come together to make informed decisions about its future. Here in Roxbury, on the land of the Massachusetts, which Europeans invaded in 1630 and Africans were brought in February of 1638.
And now I would like to introduce someone who is a great friend of the Urban Ministry and someone I'm delighted to be my co-moderator, Celia Grant. Celia is a longtime member of the Roxbury Historical Society, and she lives right here in Highland Park. She's a lover of art, of gardening, of Roxbury history, and architecture. Welcome, Celia. You're scaring me that you're gonna like abandon
right?
Celia.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Mary Margaret, for that introduction. Yeah, I was having a little bit of trouble unmuting myself, which is not usually the case. I'm usually live and present. I'm really excited to introduce one of our two presenters this evening. I'm going to introduce Andrea Gilmore, who's a noted historic preservationist. She's worked on the restoration of significant New England historic properties, including Old Ship Church in Hingham, Mass, and the Bowling Building in Nubian Square. For 20 years, Andrea served as Director of Building Conservation Associates, a consulting firm that specialized in both the technical and historical aspects of restoring buildings and works of art. Her experience is really extensive. She's done architectural conservation at the Cultural Resources Center of the National Park Service, then at Historic New England, where she became the director of the Conservation Center. She was an adjunct professor at the Historic Preservation Program of Boston University's Department of American and New England Studies, and she has served on the board of Historic Boston. Andrea has been honored with the Codman Award for Lifetime Achievement by the Boston Preservation Alliance and a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Massachusetts Historic Commission. For nearly a decade, Andrea has devoted her free time to shepherding the restoration of First Church Roxbury. We welcome Andrea, and we're going to hear from Mary Margaret about our second presenter, and welcome everybody aboard.
Thank you, Celia. I'm excited to introduce Nick Brooks. Nick is going to be with us this evening, and he is the Historic Preservation and Higher Education Lead with Dream Collaborative, which is the firm that is helping to guide our project. Nick holds a Bachelor in Architecture degree from Notre Dame, a Master's in Engineering Energy Systems, and a Certificate in Engineering Leadership from Northeastern. His focus is on a project's ecosystem, understanding the key stakeholders and understanding how to offer them real value. Through his work, Nick prioritizes the process and the why in order to enable all involved to do their best work for the best project outcomes. He's a registered architect in Massachusetts with more than 25 years of experience covering project management, project documentation, existing conditions, historic preservation, code analysis and research, and construction administration. He is skilled in facilitating a collaboration between owners, consultants, neighborhoods, city officials, and contractors to ensure a smooth construction process and timely project completion. His projects have included Nubian Square Ascends, the Blair Lot redevelopment, the Cooper Frost Austin House in Cambridge, and the Bowling Building in Nubian Square, which is the project that introduced Nick and Andrea and why they are now working together on this project here. So please welcome Andrea and Nick.
Thank you.
Hey, welcome.
Thanks, Celia.
Yeah, thank you.
Nice to have you both with us.
Thank you. So, Greg, you could start the slides for us, please. This evening, Nick and I are going to give you a short overview of the project before we go to the dialogue, which is the format in which this program is going to move forward this evening. You've seen a few of these images at the beginning of the presentation tonight, but what we're going to do now is just look at a few of them to give you a sense of both the history of the building. This is our earliest image of the building, showing it in about 1860. It's at the time when the original door is in place, but it is at the top point where the clock, which was originally a single face clock, has been changed into a three-face clock. Next, please. When we began this project in 2017, the building suffered from significant deferred maintenance. We had peeling paint, we had carpentry repairs that needed to be made, and we also had significant deficiencies in terms of access to the building and just in overall the general repair. Next slide, please. So we began a very comprehensive project of the restoration of the exterior of the building, which included the full removal of all of the paint and also the carpentry repairs that needed to proceed. It's the repainting of the building. Next, please. We celebrated the completion of the restoration of the exterior of the building in the fall of 2017. These two images, one shows the top of the steeple with the windows restored and the grand view that is actually from the hill where the church is located, as well as a group of from the restoration committee who were very instrumental in making this work happen. Next, please. And this is just a quick overview shot of the building today with those repairs completed. And also the image on the left shows the new driveway that is part of the restoration of the landscape. Next. This is just another elevation of the building showing you how significantly it's been transformed by this work. Next, please. And this is the interior of the building where we are now beginning the next phase of work. This space still exhibits all of the issues related to deferred maintenance that we have had to address on the exterior of the building. And it also presents the challenges, of course, of bringing it up to code and making the necessary or integrating the necessary systems so that it can be used for modern performance space and also to have the comfort levels that people have as expectations when they are in a space like this. Next, please. Nick is going to talk now about the interventions that have been designed to accomplish some of those goals. So I will now let him begin describing that work with this floor plan. Nick?
Sure. And I see a couple of, in a few slides, we'll probably want to talk some more about some of the preservation components. This plan itself is trying to represent what we are doing as new work. So if you look at the red line and then go to your left, you are seeing the existing space with some of the new interventions where we are removing a few rows of the pews in order to enable a performance space. The notion here is providing additional utility that hopefully breathes new life into the space, maintaining as much of the existing fabric as possible. You can also see an entry ramp at the north of your screen and a new stair that has an area of refuge, both of which are there to make sure that we provide for the accessible components of the building, providing new ways in and out of the building that get it up to code and try to deal with some of the things that were not an issue when it was constructed and reconstructed, but are part of the expectations that we have in modern facilities where we're trying to have access and provide access to all. Next slide, please. So these are a couple of renderings with before and after shots here taken from one of our models we used to reproduce the drawings. You can see, if you look at it carefully, the removal of the pews in the front row, going from the photo on the top left to the image on the top right. And getting down, you can kind of see that same the same component of the pew removal, at least for the first two, from a different vantage point. I'd be content to hear that it was difficult to understand what you're seeing in the existing photo and the rendering, because the notion is we want to make it look as seamless as possible as we try to make these interventions that bring new utility to the existing space. We're also providing a new handicap accessible ramp by removing some of the existing pews at the north side of the plan, which you can see here on the lower right-hand side of the page. Next slide, please. And I think this is an image that is trying to represent one of the interventions we have. We are reproducing the original entrance based on some of the historic photography that we have. I think, Andrea, maybe you'd like to speak to this a bit.
Well, this just is a series of photographs that shows how we are making some modest changes. The double doors that are in the upper left-hand corner are doors that were installed in about 1880, and they are not code compliant. And so what we did was we went back and we looked at the original image of the earlier historic image of the building, and discovered, as you see in the lower left-hand corner, that a door originally was a single door that is code compliant in terms of its width to meet the accessibility requirements. And so what we have done is redesign that entry with the original door, a 6-panel door flanked by freestanding columns. And this will be how the door is restored as we complete the exterior work that is integrally related to the interior work. Next, please. Nick.
Yeah, and this is one of the architectural details where we're trying to represent that the interventions that Andrea was mentioning, and again, trying to be as respectful of the existing fabric as possible. You can see an area of refuge and a landing that is trying to accommodate the accessibility requirements needed for the project, while we are also conscious of the existing fabric and ways to preserve and or use it in space. So these, the ramp that you see here is something that we are proposing and in discussion with Landmarks on, with the notion that at some point in the future, we could come back and do everything we could to restore the stairs originally, this being something probably more impermanent. The next slide, please. And this is the ramp that is on the north side of the building that we're using to provide access to a different location. This will be to allow wheelchair access and enable people to get in who have some mobility impairments or require wheelchair use. Next slide, please. Andrea?
Nick, either of us can take care of this. This is one of the ways that we've been exploring how we're going to do the restoration in the Meetinghouse. We've been doing a series of mock-ups because there is no specific recipe for exactly how this work should be done. So these series of slides show the preparation that we have done to achieve what we believe is a satisfactory level of restoration for the pews, and that would be the image that is on the right. Next. The other challenge of the pews is that they are covered with miles of upholstery, and for the new uses that are proposed for the buildings, particularly the musical performances, there is a strong desire to reduce the soft surfaces. And so what you see in the upper two images are the aged upholstery that is in pretty tough shape. And in the lower two slides, you see that upholstery has been removed. The original paneled pews have been restored. They are actually underneath that upholstery that you see in the upper slides. And then the horsehair cushions that are there have been cleaned and conserved and placed as only seat cushions. That will be the limit of the upholstery in the restored pews. Next, please.
Sure. The space also has a lot of intrinsic features or features that have been there for quite a while. And what we are seeking to do is make sure that they remain as much in kind as possible. That comes down to reproduction of the existing gas fixtures and replacing them with high efficiency LED lighting, but keeping the original aesthetic. So outside of the plaster and the paint repairs that you're probably going to see in a couple of other slides, we are looking at options that enable us to reproduce the original aesthetic of the lighting by basically one-for-one correlation between what it was gas and will be electrified. We're even going to be replacing those. We're going to be taking the gas fixtures and wiring them to be code compliant, but also electrifying the entire space. And we're looking to provide illumination for the feature chandelier via other means that don't require providing new electric fixtures in for the bulbs, but might require using some external lighting in order to try and make sure that that is still significant in the space as a feature without it actually being something that's operational. Next slide, please. And this is a slide that is showing you some of the organ. I believe this was the de-installation of it. The organ itself is now back in the space, and as part of this refurbishment will be reinstalled after being serviced. And it'll be really great to hear that in the space after the project is complete. Next slide, please. And Andrea, maybe you want to take this one.
Sure. Well, one of the things that's unique about the Meetinghouse is the series of marble plaques that are around the lower level. They commemorate people who have been associated with the building over its long history, and they will be restored as part of this project. They are important components because, as Byron Rushing was saying at the beginning of this presentation, they are part of the history of the Meetinghouse. And so one of the things that we will be doing is preserving elements in the space that have this significant interpretive potential. Next, please. And that includes this interesting series of signatures that are found around the Meetinghouse. One is from an upholsterer, and others are from craftspeople who have worked on the building. On this level of documentation, we feel is equally as important as commemorating the ministers and other significant people who served at First Church in Roxbury. And it is part of a history that we are working and very hard to preserve and interpret as part of this restoration project. Nick, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that's great. Thank you.
So that completes our slide presentation, and we will now move on to the panel discussion.
Thank you so much for that really helpful overview. And before we get started, Nick and Andrea, I did want to let the friends who are gathered as viewers this evening know that there'll be time toward the end of our program for questions and answers. So we're going to talk a bit with Andrea and Nick for a few moments. We're going to have a little commercial break, and then we'll come back and you'll have time to share your questions with Nick and Andrea. I'm going to turn it over to you, Celia.
I actually have a question that's a little off the cuff to start with. So as you guys have been renovating the interior of the building, I was wondering if you think the removal of the padding in the seating areas is going to affect the acoustics in the building, or if the removal has something to do with the removal of the soft padded areas has to do with the acoustics.
It definitely does. And it is both the strong desire of the organ restorer as well as, say, Handel and Haydn, or any of the musicians that are looking forward to performing in the space. They probably would like us to even take out the cushions, but I don't know that we can get anyone to come and attend their performances if we don't provide them with a little bit of comfort on those pews. So there's going to have to be some trade-off.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. I'm even more curious to know what the organ is going to sound and feel like in that space. Because it's going to be completely different than it was before it was taken out. But I'm wondering also, Andrea, you've been working on this project for a really long time. What drew you to it?
Oh dear. There's hardly an old church that I don't go by that doesn't draw me to it. I guess part of it, I guess, was my connection with Historic Boston Incorporated and some of the work that they've been doing in the Roxbury neighborhood. And when I was on that board, my eye caught this incredible building that sits in a very prominent location in Roxbury. And I jokingly said to my friend Kathy Cotaridis one day, what do you think I should choose for a project in retirement to keep me busy? And this is what she suggested, and it's keeping me pretty busy.
That's great. So it's Kathy's fault.
I guess if there's anyone we can blame, it's Kathy.
That's great. I'll pass it over to Mary Margaret.
Well, I guess I have a similar question for Nick. Nick, you joined this about a year ago, although it probably feels like a much longer time than that, because it is a complex project. But what drew you to this project? And more generally, what draws you to historic preservation architectural work?
Oh, that's a great question. I think for me, I think a lot of the historic work shows up as being like a curiosity for me. I've been in Boston since '99. I grew up in Connecticut, so I'm not a stranger to New England. But when you're able to go through a place like Roxbury, and then you can see things like First Church, it just cues me that there's a narrative that I'm not aware of. And anytime that I get an opportunity to be a part of understanding why, and then, checking the notion of its continued existence. They used to say, they don't build them like they used to, but I can tell you that aside from just the construction of it, there's also the preservation of any building, and the buildings that weren't loved have found a way to fall apart and be gone. So when I see buildings of this vintage that are still there and, look like they just need a light switch turned on and they're ready to go, I get very curious. So I think that thing shows up a lot for me in the preservation world, where I'm very drawn to the stories that have the buildings looking the way they do. And I don't think that this project was any different than that for me. And when I got the call from Andrew to see if we would be interested, that was extremely compelling.
Wow.
So I just want to add, so in your language, right now, the building is getting a lot of love.
In my language, the building is getting a lot of love.
A lot of love right now.
Yeah.
Wow. So a question for both of you. How did you approach honoring the historic nature of this building while trying to make it functional for this century and future?
Andrew, would you like to go first?
It's kind of a general philosophy that's related to historic buildings. You figure out how much and what is really unique that survives in the building. Then you figure out what you've got to do to it, and then try to meld the two and do as little damage or as little change to the historic building fabric. The lightest touch is, in my experience, the best way to go. And so that's typically the way I approach a project like this.
And Nick?
Yeah, for me, like, so a little bit of background on me. When I was in school, I was trained as a classicist, and that basically meant that all of our buildings started off as trying to borrow from ancient European building forms. And for me, that started architecture, my experience in architecture, with its sensibility that there was something that came before you. And it's great to build something new, but it's great to understand why things were the way they were to inform your interventions. And I think that definitely colors my perception when I'm doing any work that involves preservation. I think at least in my mind, I like to think that I honor it by curiosity and try to understand why it's there, who is there to love it, and what happened to get it to where it is. And I think by the time that I have some answers to that question, what is sacred about that space is pretty clear. And then that's what we use for any interventions.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you. From your point of view, you ran over many elements that are in the Meetinghouse: the pews and the sconces, the chandelier, the plaques, the pulpit. Were there elements that have been most important to preserve from your point of view, things that you've been most concerned about, thought were of greatest value in that space?
Yeah, I think so. But for me, it's not as tangible as all that. I think the elements are the backdrop or the artifacts of the times and the people and the way that they thought about the building. So I think there was a great image towards the end where you could see some of the craftspeople who've over time come and like given their 2 cents. And I view that as some of the things that shaped the way the building are. So I think the things that are the most important elements are the artifacts of the people. And it's really, from that point, it can be agnostic, whether it's, for me, whether it's a piece of wood trim or upholstery. It's the narrative that those things together start to tell.
Mm.
How about you, Andrea?
Well, I think the sense of space in the Meetinghouse is just remarkable. And every time I walk in there and think about how it can be used and what a unique experience it is for anyone who enters there, whether they're a performer, whether they're a speaker, whether they're someone who's just coming to seek the light and tranquility of the space. I think that is something that is really a tremendous resource in the community, and capturing that and preserving it for people to use, I think is really important. It's actually one of the reasons I love churches and the interior space of churches, because I think they do afford a space that is pretty unique in our communities. And I think it will be a tragic loss as congregations dwindle if these spaces are indeed lost as community resources. So I think that's probably the real magic in it for me.
Mm. Wow, that's pretty powerful. I'm also wondering, Andrea, you've worked on other churches. Have there been anything in any of those projects that have been especially tricky in thinking this through, or?
Well, they actually share a lot of similarities because church buildings were built for worship. They were largely built to be used on Sundays. They're not a space that is intended to be used 24/7. They're not expected to be heated and create a space that is like an office space or a meeting space where people sit and are comfortable. They were meant almost to be gathering spaces for short periods of time, where in winter you bundled yourself up. In summer, you opened the windows and you sat there and you were hot. And so, and they had a lot of things in common. They had clocks, they had beautiful light fixtures, they had items on their walls that commemorated the significant events that occur in their churches. And all of those things, I think, are pretty unique to church buildings, and keeping them contemporary or relevant is, I think, a pretty great challenge. And I think that's probably true both at First Church Roxbury and in many, many historic churches in the country, for that matter.
Wow, that's so interesting. I guess I've never really thought about churches in that way, that really originally they weren't meant to be used the way that we now sometimes use them for many things all week long. They were set up to be places that are used on Sundays or for special occasions, that kind of thing. So that's really interesting to me, because all of the modern conveniences that we have and that we need to put in place are all like to be retrofitted to this this building. It also just makes me want to ask Nick, what's something that you've learned or you're learning from this project that maybe you hadn't expected to, if there is anything?
Oh, wow. I mean, just to be clear, I might be 25, 26 years into it, but I'm always learning. Every opportunity is a chance to learn something new. And on this project, I've learned about the original rubble foundations, been able to see that. I've been able to see some of the artifacts of things getting burned. There are bits of coal that are still downstairs. I've gotten to see how the bits of the roof come together, which is different than other projects I've worked on or at. I also worked at Trinity Church in the city of Boston, which is very different than this in a lot of regards and similar in others. I think the thing that I'd take away from this, again, maybe isn't something technical that comes out of the bricks and mortar of the building. But I've actually learned a great appreciation for the UUM and the desire to take something that other people might treat as an artifact and want to have it be sort of a white glove experience, and come up with ways to both preserve it and get to the thing that I think really keeps buildings like this alive, which is the relevance.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Thanks for that comment, Nick. It means a lot, and thanks to both of you for all of those thoughtful responses. And we're gonna give our friends, the viewers, an opportunity to ask a few questions, but first, we're gonna take a brief public service announcement break to share some words from our wonderful partners and friends at the Dillaway Thomas House, which is one of the many treasures that you'll find in Roxbury. And the Dillaway Thomas House was actually built as the parsonage for the minister at First Church in Roxbury, and now is run by the state, and it's a museum telling the stories of many years through Roxbury. So here's a message from our dear partners and friends at the Dillaway Thomas House.
Hi, and welcome to the Roxbury Heritage State Park. My name is Antonio Menifee, and I'm the director.
And my name is Ina Fox, and I am the Visitor Services Supervisor here.
The park was established in 1984 by the Department of Conservation and Recreation. We're currently standing in front of the historical Dillaway Thomas House. Built in 1750, it started as a parsonage for the minister of the First Church across the street.
The park is a space for visitors to learn about Roxbury's rich history and cultures. Inside the house, we have a permanent exhibit that tells the story of Roxbury's evolution from its founding as a Puritan town in 1630 to the present day community of Roxbury, which is a rich and diverse community. So let's go inside and check out the exhibit.
Come on, follow us inside.
I'm standing in front of the kitchen hearth as it would have been when Reverend Amos Adams, pastor for the First Church, lived here. As you walk through the exhibit, you'll see that each room is devoted to a different time period in Roxbury's history and the people who are part of that history.
During the siege of Boston in 1775, the Dillaway Thomas House served as the headquarters for General John Thomas and his troops. In the 1800s, Charles K. Dillaway, who was the headmaster of the Boston Latin School, he lived here. Now, what role did Roxbury play for the American Revolution? And who were the history makers in the 1950s when Roxbury became the heart of the Black community?
You'll find the answer to those questions and many others when you explore the exhibit. To learn more about our guided tours, other programs, as well as our special exhibitions in the community gallery, please go to Roxbury Heritage State Park on the DCR website. We really look forward to your visit.
Okay, such a nice public service announcement, and I highly recommend it, a visit to the Dillaway Thomas House. So we have some questions coming in, and I'm going to start with a question for you, Nick and Andrea, from Rebecca and Gibb. Is there any thought about adding new plaques to honor people more recently associated with the Meetinghouse, people from the 20th century? And I know, Andrea, you've been part of many of those conversations, and Nick, you might also have been part of some of those, but you want to talk about this concept of adding some more, whether it's plaques or another way of honoring more recent contributions to the Meetinghouse.
Yeah, I'll defer to you to start that one, Andrea.
I think our conversations have been that plaques are very much an early 20th century sort of way of commemorating people, and that, yes, indeed, we want to add different items to our walls at First Church in Roxbury, but that a marble plaque may not be the most appropriate item or way to do it. So it may be photographs, it may be other items that do the same thing. And also it may not be as static as embedding a piece of marble in a plaster wall. That's something that's really hard to change around. And I think what we're looking for in terms of the community space that we're creating is more flexible ways of showcasing different people who have been associated with the Meetinghouse. One thing that we did do this past year, and it's not a plaque, but we did commemorate Mimi Jones and her association with the urban ministry. And that's something that's done in the landscape at the front of the building with a bench and a commemorative plaque. So indeed, this will be a space where we will have an ongoing way of honoring people who have participated in the history of the Meetinghouse and in the greater Roxbury community as well.
Thank you.
And we have a question about where the funds that helped to pay for the renovation came from. Someone from the UU Parish in Harvard Square, I think they're beginning a similar major building renovation, repair, and restoration of their 1833 building, and they're curious about how we got this funded.
I'm a moderator, but I feel like
that's a Mary Margaret
moderator. I gotta tell you, we've knocked down the doors of many, many friends. So we have wonderful friends of the urban ministry who have made significant contributions, and some of those good friends have gathered their friends. Some of them are watching this evening, and they have kind of invited their friends to what we're calling virtual cocktail parties to learn more about the ministry's work to restore the the building, and we've applied for, grants with funders and foundations, and been very fortunate to be at a $2.1 million toward our $2.8 million. So still a ways to go, but our good friends, some of them are here this evening. Thank you, have gotten us to that point, but it's a constant effort.
Wow.
All right, back to co-moderator.
Sorry about that. Elizabeth also has a second question, which is specific to their meeting house in Harvard Square, and she's asking if should the pews be removed, for fire safety requirements, that kind of thing. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think that is a difficult thing to assess without drawings and some bit of review. I would be surprised if trying to modernize a building meant that all the pews had to be removed. I think you can always be very thoughtful and trying to maintain as much of the existing character as possible while updating it. And it seems like there's probably going to be an intervention that is somewhere between the existing condition and removing pews. But without too much specific information, I would say it's highly unlikely that all the pews would need to be removed.
Yeah, and here at First Church Roxbury, we have always been working under the knowledge that the building is likely to be designated as a Boston landmark, and we did not have the option of removing all the pews. That's not to say that we even looked to do that, but we knew that was something that we would have to think very seriously about. But I think one of the things that we found reassuring and was that many of the performers who have worked in the building even prior to its full restoration said, please do not change the interior so it doesn't look like a meeting house. One of the things that's unique about First Church Roxbury and the performing that we do there is that it is a meeting house. And we, there are the Jordan halls, there are the symphony halls, there are many music venues in the city that are more modern spaces specifically designed for that. And what they've advocated for in this space is modification that made it a better space to perform in, but not modification that changed the unique features of a meeting house as a place to perform. And so I would always go cautiously, and pews can be a resource rather than the opposite, a burden.
Well, to that question about the pews, Anne asks so there are going to be a couple of rows of pews that are going to be removed. And Anne's question is, what will become of those?
They were going to be partially used for modifying some of the pews that we will be, what shall I say, not adjusting, but changing to accommodate accessible seating, to accommodate the changes of bringing the new ramp into the space. And then the other pews will be disassembled and stored. I believe that will be a requirement of the Boston Landmarks Commission. They don't have to be stored on site, but they do have to be stored. So that is the strategy that we will be pursuing.
Wow. And can you guys talk a little bit about how the number of people that the space will be able to accommodate is different from how many people it accommodates now or originally, I guess, seated?
Yeah, if I understand the question, it's related to occupancy capacity now versus originally?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think we have to be mindful of the advances in building code since its original inception, and understand that, it doesn't have an elevator and a lot of those other modern features. So a lot of components of the building right now are, let's say, out of alignment with current code. So you need to make a couple of decisions and seek variances for the things that you'd want to move forward with, as well as some of the things that you think are going to be really significant to the character of the building. And I think that we've tried to consider something that is keeping the space as intact as possible, at the same time that we are addressing the fact that there are now occupancy permits, and as we're pulling building permits for the interior of it, I think all the authorities having jurisdiction are going to want to see that and understand it. So we're taking a fairly conservative number into account, where I think we're going to be in the 400 range for occupants. And I think you can probably be seated anywhere that you'd like inside of the actual first floor, with the notion that there's going to be an occupancy limit that's going to be about the egress capacity of doors and other components that get you from the inside to a place of safety at the exterior.
Thank you for that. Anne asks, can you share a bit about what you already know about the craftspeople whose signatures you found, or what you think you might be able to be found, or what you think might be able to be found out about them and their work?
Yeah, I think Andrea, as a conservator, you might want to launch this one, or?
Actually, we have not had time to really do any of that research. There's a potential, frankly, for a lot of very interesting research projects that are associated with this restoration.
That would be a wonderful research project. I love that idea. One of
them. There's, one of the other things that's very interesting is the space preserves examples of 3 campaigns of upholstery. So we have green pews, we have orange pews, we have significant documentation for the painting. There's a trompe-l'oeil campaign of painting that has an exposed area that shows a very, very different decorative scheme in the 19th century than, of course, what survives in the building today. So in terms of interior finishes, there's just an absolute wealth of information that could be great studies. Another thing that exists is about 200 kneeling stools with remarkable samples of carpet on them. They're carefully put away. They were scattered all over the Meetinghouse when we began this project. And some of this really awaits more time than we have had in the present, because we've been so focused on getting the Meetinghouse work underway that that kind of research will be the fun that can follow the actual work when the actual work is done. So it's a wonderful thing to think about, but I have to be candid, we aren't there yet.
Well, speaking of sort of the timeline, what's the schedule here for the completion of the interior restoration? And once it's complete, how will the programming be determined and managed?
Well, I can speak to the schedule. I'm not very good at the programming. The schedule is one of the things that we have to do before we begin the actual full phase of construction for the project is to partially reinstall the restored organ so that we can safely integrate that into the space, protect it, and then begin the demolition and the building back of the historic fabric. There is the integration of a number of mechanical systems. We will be installing a full sprinkler system. We will be upgrading all of the electrical services and so forth. So there's a lot of intervention that's going to be involved. So we're hoping to do demolition in the late spring, do mechanical systems over the summer, and then begin to put the Meetinghouse back together with plaster and paint and all of those other sorts of things towards the end of 2022. It's at least a year's project. And so we hope maybe by Easter in 2023, we will be able to celebrate the full restoration of the Meetinghouse.
Thank you.
I'm going to pass it over to Mary Margaret.
Thanks, Celia. And I know there are a number of great questions. I love all these questions. We're not going to be able to get to them all, but if you, I'll put my email in the chat. And if you want to email me a question, some of your questions afterwards, I'd be happy to try to get them answered. We love hearing from people. So I'm just putting it there. In the meantime, I want to ask Mark, one of our friends and neighbors, Mark. Let me just first, before I ask Mark's question, answer the programming question. I do want to say that we had a very extensive task force. It was made up of board members, staff, neighbors, to figure out the content of the Meetinghouse activities and programming. And basically, the conclusion was that our North Star was we will base our programming on the wants and wishes of our proximate neighbors in Roxbury. And so that's how we will curate the activities and events in the Meetinghouse. And we are going to launch a new community engagement task force or committee this spring to look at how do we make sure that we have really good pathways from our neighbors in Roxbury for ongoing shaping our work, our programs, our activities. So that is to continue to develop. I do want to ask one last question from our neighbor, Mark. He said his personal preference would have been to keep the roadway that enters on Dudley Street and Roxbury Street as a gravel way. Why did you decide to pave it? And then, yeah. And then I have one more question before we go.
One of the reasons we paved it was because our upgrades were focused on the emergency vehicles that need to come onto our property as we reactivate the sanctuary. One of the components of that project, which may not be too obvious, but it was an important part of it, was to widen the gates on Dudley Street so that the emergency vehicles, by today's standards, could actually come through the gates and help fight fires and help anyone who was in need on the property. So it might have been possible to leave it grassy. You may notice that this winter we have not plowed it, trying to leave it, and we did not widen those gates. We tried to be as sensitive as possible to keep that in its historic appearance, but some of the issues that we had to address were the life safety access issues to the property, and that's part of the reason that that was changed.
Thank you. All right, last 15 seconds. And this is terrible to do this to you, but I'm still gonna try. Just very quickly, this is a very historic building. We hope it will last long into the future. What is your hope, Nick and Andrea, about what the future holds for the Meetinghouse?
If I think of the timeline and the building itself as this journey through history, and you can walk through the property, you can see different moments that would suggest that. My fondest wish for it would be that it continues to evolve and continues to represent the people and the times and the movements that come through this part of Roxbury. Kind of like the Dillway Thomas House, the notion that Malcolm X was around here. I would like to see some of those other things show up to be part of the story. And for me, the greatest honor would be to have my own little bit in that. But 200 years down the line, there's another bit of history that happened after I was gone that just meant that this was part of it still was a significant place in Roxbury.
Yeah, I just think to preserve it for the future, it has such a glorious past, and I can only hope that our stewardship and preservation of this property will make it so that it is loved and used as intensively and as well as it has been in the past. So that would be my wish. And I hope it outlasts me by hundreds of years.
Thank you both. So thank you for all that you're doing to shepherd this very complex and important project. Thank you for being with us. I want to thank my co-moderator, Celia, for being such a great co-pilot, and thank everybody for joining us tonight. And you can watch again if you go to our website.
It's a privilege to work on the project. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.
Night.
Good night.